Hello and welcome to the London Detective Society, where every story feels like a conversation over a warm cup of coffee. Tonight we journey back to the fog-draped streets of Victorian London, a place where every whisper in the mist hides a secret, and only one man dares to chase truth through the shadows. Sherlock Holmes. Chapter 1. The Widow in Black. It was a dreary November morning, the sort of morning when London's fog does not merely hang but breathes, seeping into every corner, dulling the light and muting the very sound of life itself. Even within the snug interior of our rooms at Baker Street, the gray mist had insinuated itself, dimming the glow of the hearth and turning the outlines of familiar furniture into vague shadows. I sat opposite Holmes, who, with his habitual disregard for breakfast, was deeply engrossed in the study of a small scrap of paper under his magnifying lens. The fire hissed faintly as a coal collapsed in the grate. Outside, the street noises were distant, the roll of a cab wheel, the bark of a vendor, the clang of a distant church bell, all softened by that omnipresent fog. Holmes, perched cross-legged in his dressing gown, resembled some contemplative hawk, every motion deliberate, his keen gray eyes darting between lens and note, while his long fingers traced invisible patterns upon the air. "An interesting case?" I ventured, breaking the silence. "Not yet a case, my dear Watson," said he without looking up. "Merely a curiosity. A note left anonymously at our door this morning. Observe." He slid the paper toward me. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink slightly smeared as though written in agitation. "Mr. Holmes, for the sake of a soul soon to be lost, I beg your aid. I shall call upon you at 9:30. A widow in black." I raised an eyebrow. A melodramatic signature, surely. Holmes's thin lips curved faintly. Indeed. Yet the choice of words, "soon to be lost," is not theatrical exaggeration. It is a premonition, or perhaps a confession. The question is, whose soul, and for what reason? He leaned back, folding his hands. "You observe, Watson, that the paper is expensive. Ivory vellum, faintly scented with lavender, used only by ladies of refined means. The ink, however, is cheap, purchased from a common stationer. A woman of standing disguising desperation. It suggests fear and haste." Before I could reply, the doorbell rang below, sharp and insistent. Mrs. Hudson's muffled voice followed, then the faint creak of the stairs. Holmes's eyes glimmered. "She keeps her appointment. Precisely 9:30. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson ushered in a woman dressed entirely in mourning. A long black gown trimmed with jet beads, a thick veil concealing her face, and gloved hands clutching a small reticule. She paused at the threshold, trembling as though the very air of Baker Street carried judgment. "Pray be seated, madam," said Holmes, rising courteously. "You are safe here. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my associate, Dr. Watson." Her voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. I was told you can see what others cannot." Holmes inclined his head slightly, as though receiving a compliment he neither sought nor denied. "That depends entirely, madam, upon what there is to be seen. Perhaps you will remove your veil and tell us what troubles you." With a faint hesitation, she lifted it. She was a woman of perhaps 30, though grief had carved premature lines about her eyes. Her complexion was pale, almost waxen, and her eyes, gray, luminous, and wide, had the haunted look of one who has stared too long at misfortune. "My name," she began, "is Mrs. Eleanor Harrow. My husband, Edward Harrow, died 3 nights ago in what the coroner has declared an accident." Holmes's expression did not change. "And you doubt that verdict?" "I do, sir. I doubt it with every fiber of my being." "Tell us everything," Holmes said gently, taking up his notebook. She clasped her hands together tightly, the leather of her gloves creaking faintly. Edward was a kind man once. We lived at Mortimer Lane near Kensington. For years he worked as a clerk at Harrow and Sons Bank, a respectable position. But recently he had grown distant. There were arguments, debts I did not know of, and letters. Strange letters written in a woman's hand. She drew from her reticule a folded envelope and handed it to Holmes. He examined it without comment. It arrived the night before his death, she continued. He read it by the fire and said nothing, only that he had to meet someone, urgently. He left at 8 and never returned alive. They found him the next morning at the bottom of the stairs in our home. The doctor claimed he slipped, but Mr. Holmes, he never drank and he was not clumsy. I am certain someone was in the house that night. Holmes tapped his fingers together softly. You found signs of disturbance? Only one thing, she said faintly. A small brass clock from his desk, broken and smeared with blood. The time stopped at 10 minutes past 7, but Edward left home at 8. Holmes's eyes flickered. Intriguing. The clock lies, then, or someone wished it to. She nodded quickly, tears glistening. The police dismissed it as coincidence. I came to you because I feel something dreadful is still to come. This morning I received another letter. She handed him a second envelope. Holmes opened it carefully with his penknife. Inside was a single sheet, blank except for one line written in red ink. You cannot bury truth beneath grief. The handwriting matched the earlier note precisely. Holmes's face darkened with thought. Watson, he murmured, this is no ordinary case. It breathes of forethought, of guilt taunting its victim. The woman is both target and witness. He turned to Mrs. Harrow. Madam, does anyone else reside with you? My husband's brother, Charles Harrow, she replied. He returned from India last month to settle family affairs. He has been kind, though distant. He insists Edward's death was a misstep and that I must forget it. Holmes's eyes sharpened. And do you trust him? Her lips trembled. I wish to, but there are moments, glances, silences, that fill me with dread. Last night I thought I heard footsteps outside my room. When I opened the door, the hall was empty. A long pause followed. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the faint ticking of the clock upon the mantel. Holmes rose abruptly. Watson, your hat. We shall accompany Mrs. Harrow to Mortimer Lane. There is more to be seen at that house than Scotland Yard has chosen to notice. The hansom cab rattled through the streets, wheels splashing through puddles. London passed in shades of gray. Gas lamps glowing faintly through the fog, shop fronts ghostly and blurred, figures huddled in overcoats moving like wraiths. Holmes sat silent, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed. I knew that look well. His mind was threading invisible patterns, connecting fragments no one else could yet perceive. Watson, he said suddenly, note the widow's composure. Her grief is genuine, but her fear is fresher. Less of loss, more of anticipation. Someone has promised her another blow and she expects it. You believe she is in danger? I believe she is useful to someone who wishes to manipulate her fear. Whether as pawn or target remains to be seen. When we arrived, Mrs. Harrow led us to a narrow townhouse draped in ivy, its windows curtained and its doorway marked by mourning crepe. Inside, the air was heavy with stale perfume and the faintest metallic tang of old blood. Holmes moved at once to the study where the fatal fall had occurred. The room bore that peculiar order which only grief imposes. Tidiness forced upon chaos. Holmes's gaze swept across the desk, the hearth, the stairway visible beyond the half-open door. Then, without warning, he crouched beside the carpet. Observe, Watson, he murmured. The fibers here, slightly crushed. The pattern suggests someone knelt here after the fall, perhaps to retrieve something, or to place it. He picked up the small brass clock from the side table. Its face was cracked, the hands frozen at 7:10. The wound on the deceased's head, where was it located? Holmes asked. Above the left temple, Mrs. Harrow replied softly. The doctor said he struck the stair corner. Holmes nodded absently, turning the clock in his hands. Interesting. The blood stain here lies along the upper rim, not the base. The weapon was not dropped, but swung. A blunt instrument masquerading as an accident. He glanced toward the hearth. And yet, why falsify the time? Why freeze the clock at an hour before the supposed event? He tapped the clock face sharply. A small click sounded. From beneath the brass hinge, a slip of folded paper slid free. Holmes caught it deftly. "My word!" I exclaimed. Holmes unfolded the note. Written in the same feminine hand as the earlier letters were 3 words. "Forgive me, Edward," the widow gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. "That is not mine. I swear it." Holmes's tone remained calm. "No doubt, madam. Whoever placed this note wished precisely for you to say those words." He rose, his face grave. "Watson, the implications grow darker. A staged accident, a forged letter, and an enemy who toys with guilt. There is a mind at work here, cold, calculating, deliberate." At that moment, a soft knock came at the door. A tall man entered, fair-haired, clean-shaven, with a soldier's erect bearing. Mrs. Harrow stiffened visibly. She whispered. "This is my brother-in-law, Mr. Charles Harrow." The newcomer inclined his head politely. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. I thank you for attending, though I fear my sister-in-law overburdens you with her fancies. My brother's death was tragic but simple. He missed his footing. The coroner confirmed it." Holmes regarded him with that quiet intensity which could unnerve the bravest man. "Indeed. And yet you have taken great pains, Mr. Harrow, to ensure your sister-in-law is persuaded of it." The man's expression hardened slightly. "I have merely sought to protect her sanity." "Admirable," Holmes said smoothly. "And yet one wonders why you sent her this morning's letter, written by your own hand, in red ink." Charles Harrow's composure faltered for a heartbeat, then returned. "You accuse me, sir?" "I state facts," Holmes replied. "The ink used in this letter is not common. It is a crimson drawing ink sold only at Lambert's shop in Kensington, a shop that, according to its ledger, sold 2 bottles last week. One to an artist named Dunfield, the other to a Mr. Charles Harrow." The man's color drained. I bought it for correspondence." "Indeed," Holmes interrupted softly. "For a correspondence that intended fear, not comfort. You wish to drive her to hysteria, perhaps confession. The only question is why?" Charles took a step forward, his voice rising. "You go too far, sir." "Not far enough," Holmes said coldly. "Because you are not merely a grieving brother. You are an heir, the sole inheritor of your late brother's investments, which passed to you should his widow be declared unfit or culpable. A convenient madness if you can provoke it." For a moment, silence filled the room like a drawn blade. Then the man laughed, short, sharp, bitter. "You spin clever tales, Mr. Holmes, but you cannot prove a thing." Holmes smiled faintly. "Not yet, but I shall." Charles bowed stiffly and left, slamming the door behind him. Mrs. Harrow sank into a chair, trembling. "Mr. Holmes, is it true? Could he—" Holmes rested a hand gently upon her shoulder. "Madam, truth has a way of revealing itself, even through fog. For now, lock your doors tonight. Trust no letters, no messengers, and no comforts from that man. Watson and I will watch from a distance." She nodded, pale as porcelain. As we stepped back into the street, the fog had thickened until even the gas lamps burned like blurred moons. Holmes stood for a moment, his silhouette ghostly in the mist, pipe unlit, eyes distant. "A cruel game, Watson," he murmured. "To torture a woman's sanity for inheritance. Yet there is something deeper. I feel the threads tightening, the clock, the ink, the letters, all arranged with artistry. Our adversary is not a brute, but a mind that relishes performance." He glanced up, and the faint glow of a street lamp caught his sharp profile, the hawk again scenting prey through clouded air. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "The game has begun." Chapter 2. Echoes at Mortimer Lane. The fog that morning was heavier than the last, thick as wool and tinted with the dull gold of the sun struggling to pierce it. London seemed less a city and more a dream, a place of sound and shadow where reality and illusion shared the same cobblestone. When Holmes and I set out once more toward Mortimer Lane, the horses of our cab moved cautiously, their breath steaming like smoke in the cold air. Holmes was silent most of the way, his gloved hands resting lightly on his cane, his hat pulled low over his eyes. I had long learned not to disturb his thoughts during such intervals. They were the workings of that extraordinary mental mechanism which required silence, as a laboratory requires stillness. Yet there was a tension in his posture, a subdued energy that betrayed how fully this new mystery had captured his intellect. At last, as we turned into the narrower streets of Kensington, he spoke. "Watson," said he, "have you considered the curious symbolism of that clock?" "I have thought only that it was used as a weapon," I replied. "Precisely, but the choice of weapon is of consequence. Why a clock? Why falsify time? To strike with a clock is theatrical, unnecessary, and yet deeply meaningful. The killer wished to make time itself a witness and then to silence it. It is an act of artistry, not impulse. We are not dealing with a mere brute, but with a mind both intelligent and cruel." I nodded, though my understanding lagged behind his leaps of deduction. "And you believe Charles Harrow capable of such calculated deceit?" Holmes's eyes narrowed. "I believe him capable of motive, but not of execution. There is subtlety here beyond his reach. I suspect he is one actor upon the stage, but not the playwright." He leaned back, his gaze distant. "No, Watson. There is a hidden hand guiding the entire composition, and we have only glimpsed its shadow." We arrived shortly thereafter at the Harrow residence, the same somber townhouse on Mortimer Lane. Mrs. Harrow awaited us in the drawing-room, her black attire unchanged, though her eyes betrayed a night of sleepless terror. "Mr. Holmes," she said quickly, "there was noise again last night. Faint movements below the stairs. When I looked, I found the study door ajar. Yet I had locked it myself before retiring." "Did you notice anything disturbed?" Holmes asked. "Only this." She held out a small object wrapped in a handkerchief. When she unfolded it, I saw a tiny piece of torn paper, a corner of a letter, the edges charred as though someone had tried to burn it. Upon it were 3 words, faint but legible. "The photograph remains." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Excellent, madam. You have done well to preserve this, may I?" He took the fragment carefully and studied it beneath his lens. "The handwriting matches that of the earlier notes, and yet this was not intended for you. The phrasing implies correspondence, perhaps between the murderer and an accomplice." "The photograph," I murmured, recalling her earlier mention of family possessions. "Precisely, Watson. The word remains suggests survival, something the killer failed to destroy." He rose abruptly. "We must examine your late husband's study again. Every drawer, every frame, every trace of paper. There lies the next clue." Mrs. Harrow led the way, her hands trembling as she held the candle. The room was exactly as we had left it, somber, airless, and orderly to the point of unease. Holmes began his methodical inspection, moving from wall to wall, tapping, peering, listening. His movements were as graceful as those of a cat, his concentration unbroken even as the floor creaked beneath him. At last, he paused before the large mahogany writing desk. "Watson, observe this lock, newly scratched around the keyhole. Someone has used a tool upon it recently, and in haste." He produced a slender blade from his pocket and worked the mechanism deftly. Within seconds, the drawer slid open with a reluctant sigh. Inside lay a collection of bank statements, private correspondence, and a small black case of polished wood. Holmes lifted the case. "A photographic box," he murmured. He unclasped it. Inside lay several glass negatives, their surfaces glinting faintly in the dim light. "By Jove!" I exclaimed. "He was a photographer." "Amateur, likely, but one of these plates may reveal what our letter fragment feared. The photograph remains." He held one up to the window, squinting through it. The faint outlines of a man and woman emerged, seated by a fireplace. Holmes frowned. "Watson, note the gentleman. Unmistakably Edward Harrow. And the lady?" He froze. "What is it, Holmes?" "The lady is not his wife." I looked closer. Indeed, the features, though faint, were not Mrs. Harrow's. This woman was younger, with darker hair and a smile of startling familiarity, one that seemed to mock us across the veil of time. Holmes set the plate down carefully. "So, the missing link begins to take form. These photographs are the key. Blackmail, perhaps, or passion turned to vengeance." "Do you think the woman is the author of the letters?" I asked. "Possibly. But consider this. If she wrote to Edward before his death and her handwriting now appears upon threats sent afterward, then either she yet lives, or someone imitates her hand to mislead us. In either case, the motive lies buried in this liaison." He replaced the negatives and closed the case. "We must discover who this woman is. Mrs. Harrow," he said, turning to her. "Did your husband ever speak of any acquaintance of a, shall we say, confidential nature?" The widow flushed faintly and looked away. "No, Mr. Holmes, but there was a name I heard him speak once when he thought me asleep. He muttered it in distress, 'Clara,' and then fell silent." "Clara," Holmes repeated softly. "An uncommon name in such company. Very good. That may prove our first thread." At that moment, a heavy knock sounded from below. Footsteps approached, firm, deliberate, and then a voice called out, "Police! Inspector Lestrade to see Mr. Holmes." Holmes exchanged a brief glance with me. "Ah, our gallant ally from Scotland Yard. Let us see whether the official mind has moved an inch since yesterday." Lestrade entered, removing his hat and shaking off the damp. "Morning, Mr. Holmes. Doctor, Mrs. Harrow." He gave a courteous nod to the widow, who stiffened slightly at his presence. "I've come because there's been a development. The coroner's office finished their examination of Mr. Harrow's injuries. Seems there was bruising on the back of the neck, not consistent with a fall." Holmes smiled thinly. "At last the Yard awakens. And your conclusion?" Lestrade bristled slightly. "Well, it suggests someone might have pushed him, but there's no sign of struggle, no fingerprints worth mentioning, and the widow here." Holmes raised a hand. "We are beyond suspicion of Mrs. Harrow, Inspector. The true question is who benefits from both her despair and his death." Lestrade frowned. "You think it's the brother?" "I think," said Holmes slowly, "that the brother is too visible. His hostility, his inheritance motive, all too neatly displayed. It feels arranged." Lestrade scratched his chin. "You mean someone wants us to think it's him?" "Precisely." Holmes turned back to the desk. gesturing toward the open drawer. "Observe, Lestrade, these photographs. They were hidden, poorly. Why conceal what could be destroyed? Because someone wanted them found, at the right moment." Lestrade grunted. "You've got a devilish way of making everything sound planned, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's eyes glinted. "In London, Inspector, everything is planned, from murders to marriages." He turned to Mrs. Harrow. "Madam, I must ask one last favor. Tonight you will host a visitor. Invite your brother-in-law to supper. Speak kindly, but mention that we have discovered a set of photographs your husband kept locked away. Watch his reaction carefully. Watson and I will observe unseen." She hesitated. "You mean to test him?" "To test him, or draw out the one manipulating him. Either way, truth will answer." Lestrade looked doubtful. "Seems dangerous." Holmes smiled faintly. "So is ignorance." That evening, the house at Mortimer Lane lay wrapped in mist and silence. Holmes and I had taken up a concealed position in the small conservatory adjoining the drawing room, our view partially obscured by heavy curtains. Mrs. Harrow sat near the fire, pale but composed. A table was set for two, the silver gleaming softly in the lamplight. At precisely 8 o'clock, Charles Harrow arrived. He removed his gloves and overcoat with practiced grace, his expression one of polite concern. "You look pale, Eleanor," he said smoothly. "Are you unwell?" "Only weary," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It has been a dreadful few days, yet something curious came to light today. Mr. Holmes discovered some of Edward's old photographs." Charles froze mid-motion. "Photographs?" "Yes, of him and a woman you knew, perhaps." A muscle in his jaw twitched. No, I was not aware." She looked at him steadily. "You seemed uneasy when Mr. Holmes mentioned them." He forced a laugh. "Nonsense. It merely surprises me, that's all." "Indeed," she said softly. "The woman's name was Clara." This time the mask slipped entirely. His eyes widened, his face drained of color. He rose abruptly, knocking his glass to the floor. "Clara?" he repeated hoarsely. "Where did you hear that name?" "I told you," she said, trembling slightly. "It was written." He cut her off. "Burn them. Burn those photographs. Do you hear me? They bring nothing but ruin." From behind the curtain, Holmes's expression sharpened. "Ruin for whom, Mr. Harrow?" he murmured under his breath. "For your brother's memory? Or for you?" Mrs. Harrow's hands clenched the edge of the tablecloth. "Why would they bring ruin? Who is Clara?" Charles paced, agitated. She was a mistake. Edward was a fool to trust her. Leave it be, Eleanor, for your own sake." She shook her head. "Not until I know everything." He turned on her, his voice cold. "Then you will regret it." At that moment, Holmes stepped from behind the curtain, his figure tall and spectral in the lamplight. "I fear the only one who shall regret it, Mr. Harrow, is you." Charles recoiled, eyes widening in fury. You've been spying on us." "Observing," Holmes corrected. "You speak of ruin, sir. Yet it is not your brother's indiscretion that haunts you, but your own. You were entangled with this Clara as well. When she turned her affection, or her schemes toward Edward, jealousy became hatred. You forged her hand, killed your brother, and sought to drive his widow to madness." Charles's voice trembled with rage. "You cannot prove that." Holmes smiled faintly. "Perhaps not yet. But I have found something you overlooked, a fingerprint in red ink upon the second threatening letter. A fingerprint belonging, I dare say, to a man who handled the same ink purchased at Lambert's shop in Kensington." For a moment the room was silent except for the faint hiss of the fire. Then with a sudden movement, Charles lunged toward the desk drawer. where, unknown to him, Lestrade had already been waiting. The inspector rose from his concealment like an avenging wraith, catching the man's wrist midair. "I'll take that, Mr. Harrow," said Lestrade grimly. Charles struggled once, then sagged, defeated. "It was her fault," he muttered bitterly. "That woman, not Clara. She ruined us all. I only wanted the letters back. I only wanted peace." Holmes regarded him coolly. "Peace, Mr. Harrow, is not purchased with blood." As Lestrade led him away, Mrs. Harrow sank to her knees, her face buried in her hands. I went to her at once, but Holmes remained motionless, his gaze fixed upon the dying fire. When at last we left the house, the fog had begun to lift, revealing the first pale gleam of dawn. "Holmes," I said quietly, "do you believe him guilty of murder?" Holmes shook his head slowly. "No, Watson. He is guilty of deceit and cruelty, but not of the final act. His rage tonight was genuine surprise at the name Clara. Someone else, someone unseen, orchestrated this game from the start. We have caught the pawn, but not the player." He turned his collar up against the chill and smiled faintly into the fading mist. "The photograph remains," he murmured. "And so does the truth. Come, Watson, the next move is ours." And as the morning light crept over London's rooftops, I felt for the first time that the shadow haunting Mrs. Harrow's house had only just begun to show its full shape. Chapter 3. The Clock That Lied. The morning light slanted weakly through the soot-streaked windows of 221B Baker Street. A thin mist still lingered beyond the panes, wrapping the street in a pale melancholy. Holmes sat in his armchair, robe of dark Persian silk flowing around him, the ever-present pipe curling thin trails of smoke toward the ceiling. His keen eyes were half closed, his fingers steepled under his chin. I knew that posture well. It was the pose of a mind that had already begun to dance upon a problem's invisible strings. I had just returned from a patient visit when Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, her face carrying that familiar mixture of concern and curiosity. "Telegram for you, Mr. Holmes," she said, holding out a folded yellow slip. Holmes extended his hand without looking up. He read it once, then again. "Watson," he said, "it appears our case has grown a most curious limb." I laid my hat aside. "Another message from Mrs. Hanbury?" "Indeed. She requests our immediate presence at Mortimer Lane. The police have concluded their preliminary inspection and released the premises. Yet she insists something has been overlooked, something to do with the clock." "The clock?" I repeated, puzzled. Holmes rose with a sudden energy, his thin figure springing into motion like a coiled spring. "Quite so, my dear fellow. She states that the clock in her late husband's study struck midnight thrice last night, though it was still broken and unwound. An impossibility unless one admits the hand of the living or the deceit of the clever. Within half an hour we were rattling down through the narrow arteries of London in a hansom cab, the city half lost in fog and clatter. The scent of wet cobblestones and horse sweat mingled with the cold breath of the river. Holmes's eyes gleamed as he stared out the window, every turn of the wheel a note in the great symphony of deduction that played perpetually within his mind. "You see, Watson," he said, "time is the most deceitful witness of all. It records everything, yet tells nothing unless properly questioned. I suspect our clock has a testimony of its own." At Mortimer Lane, Mrs. Hanbury awaited us in a morning gown of jet black, her veil drawn, though her voice trembled with urgency. "Mr. Holmes, forgive me for disturbing you again. I could not rest. The clock in my husband's study, his most prized possession, came to life last night. It struck 12, though no hand wounded, and the constable swore it was still broken." "An odd resurrection," Holmes murmured. "Where is the timepiece now?" "In the study, just as before." The room was as we had left it 2 days earlier. a dim chamber smelling faintly of tobacco and brass polish. The desk was large and severe, the curtains drawn against the gray morning. On the mantel stood the clock, a heavy French carriage clock of fine workmanship, its brass frame dulled with dust, its face cracked clean through the center like a wound. Holmes approached it with reverence, bending low until his aquiline nose nearly brushed the glass. "Note, Watson. The crack runs diagonally from the numeral 11 down through the minute hand's pivot. Curious placement. See here. Residue on the inner rim of the casing, wax or perhaps oil." He produced his lens and studied the details with surgical precision. I leaned closer. Could someone have tampered with it? Most assuredly. Observe the mainspring, partially rewound, yet not by a key. There are faint scratches about the slot. I should say a knife blade, perhaps the same kind as our murderer's weapon. He turned, suddenly toward Mrs. Hanbury. "Madam, may I ask who last handled this clock before your husband's death?" She hesitated. "Only George himself. He was meticulous about such things. He would polish it every Sunday as if it were a relic. After his death, I could not bear to touch it." Holmes's gaze softened briefly, then hardened again with inquiry. "And yet it moved. The impossible rarely occurs without the assistance of the improbable. Tell me, were there visitors last evening?" "Only Inspector Lestrade," she said faintly. "He came to return some personal effects from the station." Holmes's eyes flickered. "Lestrade is honest to a fault, but not infallible. Watson, note the faint outline of mud upon the carpet. Someone stood here last night and their shoes were wet. Yet Mrs. Hanbury's hem is spotless, and Lestrade would never tread without wiping his feet. There was another." He crouched by the hearthrug, running his finger along the edge of the skirting board. "Dust displaced, and a hair, coarse, dark, not the widow's. A man's." Mrs. Hanbury clutched her gloved hands together. "What does it mean, Mr. Holmes? Who could have been here?" Holmes rose, brushing off his hands. "That, madam, is what we shall learn before the day's end. Watson, to the desk. Examine the inkstand." I obeyed, finding the ink thick and congealed, yet the nib of the pen was freshly wet. "Someone wrote here quite recently," I said. Holmes nodded, producing a small strip of blotting paper from the stand. "Let us see what ghosts remain." Holding it to the light, faint reversed words emerged. "Meet under clock 12. A meeting at midnight," Holmes said softly. "And the clock itself bears witness." He straightened and paced the room twice, his coat-tails swaying. "Mrs. Hanbury, did your husband have any acquaintances of a mechanical inclination?" She frowned. "There was one. Mr. Avery, his business partner, a watchmaker before they founded their firm. But they quarreled bitterly over money some months ago." "Ah," Holmes's eyes shone. "The clock, the hour, the betrayal. It fits too neatly for chance." He turned to me. "Watson, fetch your revolver. I suspect our adversary is clever enough to return for his masterpiece." Before I could respond, the faintest creak sounded from the corridor beyond. Holmes raised a finger, his whole being alert. We waited in silence. The next instant, the door burst inward and a figure lunged from the shadows. A man in a rough coat, his face half shrouded by a scarf. In his hand gleamed a slender blade. Holmes moved with astonishing speed. With a twist of his arm, he caught the man's wrist and sent the knife clattering to the floor. I sprang forward, pinning the intruder's other arm as Holmes snatched away the scarf. "Mr. Avery, I presume," Holmes said coolly. The man's eyes darted wildly. "You've no proof," he spat. "The clock was mine by right. He cheated me. It was I who built it, every cog, every spring. He stole my design." "Ah, the eternal refrain of the wrong genius," Holmes murmured. "And so you decided to reclaim it, with interest in blood." Avery's breath came fast. I only wanted him to sign the papers. The clock was our meeting signal, our old code. He was to wind it when ready. I came last night, but he was dead. I thought to retrieve my creation before the police could seize it. Holmes's expression remained grave. Yet you forgot, Mr. Avery, that timepieces rarely lie. You rewound the spring, leaving your mark upon it. You wrote upon the blotter. You left your footprint in the dust. And above all, you returned to destroy the evidence. Alas, your clock betrayed you. Avery sagged as the truth closed around him. He deserved it, he whispered. He ruined me. Holmes looked at him without triumph, only weary understanding. Perhaps. But vengeance keeps poor time, my good man. It strikes long after the hour of reason. When Lestrade arrived to take the prisoner, he found Holmes once again seated before the fire, the clock ticking faintly on the mantel as if nothing had ever gone amiss. I could not help but glance at it, shuddering. To think, Holmes, that a simple clock could reveal so much. Holmes smiled faintly. There is nothing simple about time, Watson. It is the most precise liar in existence. It tells us only what we ask it to, and conceals what we fail to imagine. He drew deeply from his pipe, the smoke curling upward like the fading memory of the crime itself. Mark my words, Watson, he said quietly. This case is far from over. The clock may have spoken, but there is still one secret it keeps. And in the hush of Baker Street that night, as the fog pressed gently against the glass, I wondered, what truth could even time be afraid to tell? Chapter 4. Footprints in the Fog. London, that eternal city of secrets, awoke under a cloak of mist the following morning. The air hung heavy with damp and silence, broken only by the mournful clang of a distant church bell. From my chair by the window of 221B Baker Street, I watched the fog twist through the streets like a living thing, soft, ghostly fingers reaching up from the cobblestones. Holmes stood at the mantel, his long, thin frame draped in a gray dressing gown, violin tucked beneath his chin. The soft, melancholic notes filled the room, seeming to merge with the sigh of the city outside. The melody was not cheerful. It never was when Holmes's mind was in turmoil. You are troubled, I remarked. Troubled, Watson? He let the final note fade into silence. No, intrigued, disturbed perhaps by the irregularities of human deceit. He set the violin aside and poured himself a cup of coffee. Avery's confession solves the question of the clock, but not the case. His story lacks one essential element. Truth, but he admitted to returning to Mortimer Lane, I protested. He handled the clock, left the footprints, even the blotting paper proves it. Indeed. Yet he insists he found Hanbury already dead. Consider that, Watson. Our suspect returns to recover an invention, not to kill. The body was cold when he entered by his own account, and I believe him. I blinked. You believe him? Holmes smiled faintly, eyes glittering. To a degree, Avery's hands are those of a craftsman, not a killer. His rage was old, worn thin by failure. A crime of passion burns hot, is smoldered too long. No. There is another player in this game, one who moves unseen through the fog. He took up his hat and coat. Come, Watson, we return to Mortimer Lane. The dead may yet speak if we listen closely enough. The cab jolted through the streets, wheels clattering over wet stones. London was half asleep in the gray dawn, the lamps still lit like dim yellow eyes watching through the fog. We arrived to find the constable on duty pacing before the Hanbury residence, his boots leaving deep prints in the soft mud. Good morning, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he said, touching his cap. Inspector Lestrade's been and gone. Says the place is cleared. Excellent, Holmes replied briskly. Then we shall conduct our own examination, unimpeded by Scotland Yard's tidiness. Inside, the air was colder than before. The house seemed emptier, stripped of its earlier grief. The faint scent of lavender lingered where Mrs. Hanbury had taken refuge upstairs. Holmes strode directly to the hallway. Watson, observed these marks upon the floor, footprints faint but distinct. I bent to look. The boards bore dark smudges barely visible in the dim light. Boot prints, I said. 2 sets by the look. Precisely, said Holmes. Avery's we know, heavy, broad-toed with the notch of a cobbler's patch near the heel. But here, see this? A narrower sole, finer leather with the faint impression of a heel plate. The stride is measured, deliberate. A woman's shoe, I'd wager, though not our widow's. She wears mourning slippers. I felt a shiver despite the warmth of my coat. Then someone else entered the house before or after the murder. Holmes knelt, tracing one print with his finger. The direction of the stride indicates she came from the study and left by the side door. And note, the mud upon the sole is not the same as that found near the street entrance. This is garden soil, clay-heavy and damp. She entered from the garden path. Then she must have known the layout, I murmured. Indeed, Watson, the killer was not an intruder, but someone familiar with the Hanbury home. Holmes rose, his expression sharpening with purpose. To the garden. The fog lay thick over the courtyard, curling through the iron railings and ivy like ghostly smoke. The garden itself was small but neat. Hedges trimmed, rows, bushes bare for winter, and a stone path leading to a low gate opening onto the alley behind. Holmes moved like a hound scenting the trail. Ah, here we are. He pointed to a fresh impression in the mud, a small pointed shoe print near the gate. Beside it, half buried in the soil, glinted something metallic. He stooped and retrieved it. It was a small key ornate of brass. The bow engraved with the initials G.H. Holmes turned it in his fingers. George Hanbury, he murmured. And yet Mrs. Hanbury assured us all her husband's keys were accounted for. Curious, is it not, that one should lie forgotten in the garden? Dropped perhaps by our unknown visitor, I suggested. Possibly, or deliberately placed to mislead. Let us not decide too soon. He slipped the key into his pocket and examined the gate latch. Recently oiled, no rust on the hinge. Someone ensures this route remains usable. He turned suddenly toward the back windows. Look, Watson, there. Through the haze, a faint light flickered in the neighboring house, an adjoining property divided by a narrow hedge. Holmes's gaze narrowed. Number 18, Mortimer Lane. Vacant, according to the constable. Yet someone burns a lamp at midday. Shall we pay our neighbor a call? The adjoining house was quiet, its curtains drawn, door half ajar as if inviting the curious. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and smoke. Dust cloaked the furniture, but upon the dining table lay recent disturbances. A woman's shawl, a pair of gloves, and a half-empty teacup still faintly warm. Holmes bent over the cup, inhaling lightly. Jasmine tea, rarely found outside select establishments in Soho. Not a servant's drink. Our mysterious lady has refined habits. He turned his attention to the mantel, where a framed photograph stood amid dust. It showed George Hanbury beside a younger woman, dark-haired, poised, with striking eyes that seemed almost alive even in the faded image. Watson, Holmes said softly. We have seen her before. The very same face adorns the miniature upon Mrs. Hanbury's locket. The sister, if I am not mistaken, Clara Vane. I recalled the widow's trembling mention of her estranged sibling, a woman she had not spoken to in years. You think she was here? I think she never left, Holmes replied grimly. This room was occupied until very recently. Note the ash upon the hearth, still warm. And here, He stooped, drawing a sheet of paper from beneath the rug. A torn letter. He pieced the fragments together carefully upon the table. The handwriting was elegant but forceful. George, meet me at the old place before midnight. We must speak alone. She must not know. Holmes's expression hardened. So our dear Mr. Hanbury planned a meeting not with his partner but with his wife's sister. The clock's signal, midnight thrice, was not for Avery at all. I exhaled slowly. Then Clara Vane came to the study through the garden path unseen. They argued, perhaps passionately, and she killed him, Holmes finished softly. Whether by intent or in the heat of anger remains to be seen. But she left her trail as all do and now hides in the fog. He turned to the window, peering through the haze. Watson, the constable mentioned seeing a woman near the river last night matching no local description. A hansom waited near the bridge. We shall find her there, or at least her shadow. The River Thames rolled beneath a blanket of mist as the afternoon waned. The lamps along the embankment glowed dimly, their reflections trembling on the water's surface. Holmes and I walked in silence, our breath clouding the air. At last, near the arch of Blackfriars Bridge, a figure emerged from the fog. A woman veiled, standing alone by the railing. Even through the haze, her posture spoke of dread. Holmes approached gently. Miss Clara Vane, I believe. She started, turning sharply. Beneath her veil, her eyes flashed with fear and defiance. Who are you? Sherlock Holmes. Your brother-in-law's death concerns me deeply. Her gloved hands trembled. I had nothing to do with it. You must believe me. Holmes inclined his head. I believe many things, Miss Vane. Belief, however, is not proof. You met George Hanbury on the night of his death. Your own letter attests to it. Her lips parted in shock. You found it? Yes. And we found your footprints in the garden, your tea still warm in the house next door. You have been hiding in the shadow of your sister's grief. For a moment she said nothing. Then her composure cracked. I went to beg him, to tell him to end it. He wished to leave my sister, to elope with me. I was mad enough once to agree, but when I saw what I had done, I wanted only to stop him. We argued, yes, but I swear he was alive when I left. Holmes's voice was calm but sharp. And the clock? Her eyes filled with tears. It was his signal. I touched it only to silence it. It kept striking as if possessed. I didn't know it would betray me. Holmes regarded her in silence for a long moment, then turned to me. Watson, note her pulse. Rapid, yet steady. She speaks truth in panic, not guilt. No murderer could weep so purely. He looked again to Clara. You have told me what you know. Go to your sister, confess everything except your fear. Leave the rest to me. She stared at him, bewildered. You mean, you don't think I killed him? Holmes's gaze drifted toward the river where the current swirled darkly beneath the bridge. No, Miss Vane. You were a pawn, not a hand. The true killer moves still, clever, quiet, and unseen. As she disappeared into the mist, I turned to him. Then who, Holmes? He lit his pipe, the flame briefly illuminating his sharp profile. Someone who knew of both letters, the one sent to Avery and the one to Clara. Someone who wanted each to believe they were the intended rendezvous. A manipulator who thrives upon misdirection. I frowned. But who could that be? He exhaled slowly, the smoke mingling with the fog. Only one person had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to pit them against one another. The widow herself, Watson. Mrs. Hanbury. I stopped short. Surely not. She was distraught. Ah, the perfect disguise, Holmes murmured. She played the role beautifully. But her grief came too swiftly, her tears too readily. A woman who kills for betrayal does not wail, she watches. He turned away, his coat swirling around him. "Tonight, my dear Watson, we set the final snare. Let the widow's clock strike once more, and see which ghost it summons." And as the fog deepened, swallowing the city whole, I felt the chill of something far colder than the night air. A truth that ticked in silence, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 5. The Butcher's Secret. That night, London lay buried beneath a heavier fog than I had ever seen. The lamps burned like dying embers in a sea of gray, their light swallowed a few feet from the glass. Even the bells of St. Paul's sounded distant and hollow, as though muffled by the very air. In our sitting room at Baker Street, Holmes paced restlessly, the floor creaking beneath his quick, deliberate steps. "The widow is playing a game, Watson," he said at last, stopping abruptly by the window. "But she is not playing it alone." I looked up from my notes. "You suspect an accomplice?" Holmes turned, eyes sharp with that peculiar brightness which only the scent of truth could awaken. "Indeed. Consider the scene, Watson. A man dies without sign of forced entry. His wife weeps convincingly. His partner arrives too late. His sister-in-law flees in guilt. And yet, there are traces of another hand entirely. One who entered unseen, left by the servants' passage, and took with them blood." "Blood," I repeated, startled. "Quite so. Lestrade sent me the coroner's notes this afternoon. The wound upon Hanbury's neck was not clean. It was jagged, deep, and made by a blade both heavy and curved. Not the slender knife Avery carried, nor a household implement. No, Watson. It was the mark of a butcher's cleaver." I frowned. "But what butcher would have cause to kill George Hanbury?" Holmes smiled grimly. "That is what we are about to learn." We reached the marketplace near Spitalfields by 9 o'clock. The fog hung thick as wool, muffling the calls of vendors and the clatter of carts. The smell of raw meat and sawdust clung to the air. Beneath the iron awning, a line of stalls stretched into shadow. Most closed for the night save one. A burly man in a blood-stained apron stood there, sharpening a cleaver with deliberate care. His hair was graying, his eyes small and wary. The sign above his stall read, "Thomas Briggs, Family Butcher." Holmes approached with his usual polite indifference. "Good evening, Mr. Briggs. We were told you supply meats to Mortimer Lane." Briggs eyed him suspiciously. "I do, sir. To Mrs. Hanbury's household 3 times a week. Why do you ask?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Only curiosity. I find it interesting that your deliveries ceased 2 days before Mr. Hanbury's death." The man's knife paused mid-motion. "They didn't need nothing more that week," he said after a moment. "That's all." "Indeed. And yet you were seen behind Mortimer Lane the night before last." Briggs's eyes narrowed. "Who says that?" Holmes ignored the question, leaning lightly on his cane. "You see, Mr. Briggs, we are investigating a matter in which a blade much like yours played a regrettable part. I should be sorry to think your tools were borrowed without permission." Briggs set the cleaver down, hands tightening on the counter. "You're saying I'm a killer, is that it?" Holmes's voice was calm. "I am saying you were there." The butcher's jaw worked silently. Then at last he exhaled through his nose. I was there, but I didn't kill him. I went to see her, Mrs. Hanbury." "Ah," Holmes murmured. "Now we near the heart." Briggs rubbed a hand across his stubbled chin. "You wouldn't understand, gentlemen. I'd known her before she married him. We were sweethearts once, years back. She came to me that night, sent word she needed help. Said she feared her husband had learned of some business of hers. Asked me to meet her by the back gate, bring my knife. Said it was to scare him, nothing more." Holmes's face remained unreadable. "And you obliged?" "Aye. Fool that I am. When I reached the house, the door was ajar. She was inside crying over him. Said she found him that way. Told me to get rid of the knife. It'd look bad if anyone saw it. I tossed it in the river just like she asked. And she rewarded your loyalty with silence, Holmes said softly. You have not seen her since? Briggs shook his head miserably. Not a word. Holmes regarded him for a moment, then nodded. Mr. Briggs, you have done wrong, but perhaps not irredeemably. I advise you to stay within reach of the law tonight. You may yet find honesty to be your safest refuge. As we left the market, I turned to Holmes in bewilderment. So the widow used him, an old lover, to destroy evidence? Precisely, Holmes said, drawing his coat close against the fog. She lured Avery and Clara to Mortimer Lane with letters, killed her husband with a blade borrowed from the one man foolish enough to obey her, and then framed them both by weaving their guilt together. A masterpiece of misdirection. I felt a chill. Then why summon us? Why risk discovery? Holmes's lips curved faintly. Ah, vanity, Watson, the final sin of the intelligent criminal. She wished not only to deceive the law, but to test me, to see if her performance could fool even Sherlock Holmes. He stopped suddenly beneath a gas lamp, its glow faint against the fog. Tomorrow morning we visit the widow once more. Let us see how long her mourning veil can hide a murderer's eyes. And with that he strode off into the swirling gray, his figure vanishing like a shadow into the heart of London's mist. Chapter 6. Letters from the dead morning light crept hesitantly through the fog, spilling pale and cold across Baker Street. Holmes sat at the breakfast table, untouched toast at his side, eyes fixed upon a thin stack of papers before him. They were old letters, yellowed, creased, their ink faded to brown. Watson, he said quietly, these have just been delivered from Lestrade, found in a drawer beneath Hanbury's writing desk. The drawer had been sealed with wax and false lining. It appears our widow had secrets far older than her grief. I set down my cup and leaned forward. From whom? Holmes handed me the top letter. The handwriting was elegant, masculine, the kind one might expect from a gentleman of standing. The date at the top read, February 1887. My dearest Eleanor, I cannot bear the thought of him discovering us. If he learns the truth, it will be my ruin and your undoing. You must keep the child's parentage concealed at all costs. I will send what funds I can, though I fear my name can never be attached to yours. Burn this letter, forget me. See, I looked up in astonishment. Good heavens, this cannot mean... Precisely, Holmes interrupted, rising to his feet. The widow's child was not Hanbury's at all. She was maintaining a lie, one that once uncovered would have shattered her carefully built life. And so she killed the man who threatened to reveal it. But who is C? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. That, my dear Watson, is the question that will unravel the final knot. An hour later, we were once again at Mortimer Lane. The air was sharp with the chill of dawn, and the house stood silent as a tomb. The maid, pale and uneasy, admitted us without protest. Mrs. Hanbury awaited in the parlor, dressed impeccably in black silk, her veil drawn, though no tears stained her cheeks. Mr. Holmes, she said softly, you return again. Have you discovered the villain who took my husband's life? Holmes bowed slightly. Indeed, madam, I have discovered many villains, though some are more charming than others. Her gloved hand stiffened upon the chair's arm. You speak in riddles. Holmes stepped closer, his voice low and precise. I speak of letters, Mrs. Hanbury. Letters written by a man whose name begins with C. Letters that prove your husband was not the child's father, but rather your convenient disguise. For the first time, her composure faltered. You have no right. I have every right, Holmes said sharply. For in your attempt to conceal a private shame, You committed a public sin. George Hanbury discovered the truth, that your son was fathered by another. He threatened exposure, and you silenced him with a butcher's blade, borrowed through deceit. Then you lured both Avery and your sister to the scene, ensuring suspicion would fall elsewhere. She rose abruptly, her veil trembling. You cannot prove such wild accusations. Holmes withdrew the letter and placed it upon the table. This handwriting belongs to one Charles Avery, does it not? The widow's breath caught. Yes, Holmes continued calmly. He confessed as much to me last evening, though unaware of what he revealed. He thought to protect you. Even now, the fool still loves you. He believed you a victim of your husband's cruelty, not its cause. Mrs. Hanbury's face turned white as marble. She sank slowly back into her chair. You do not understand, she whispered. George was a monster. He found those letters years ago, held them over me. I lived in terror of him. I thought, if he were gone, I could be free. Holmes regarded her in silence for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said quietly, freedom bought with blood is only another kind of prison. Her eyes filled with tears, though whether from remorse or despair I could not tell. What will happen to my boy? She asked faintly. Justice will take pity on him, Holmes said. But as for you, madam, your fate lies beyond my reach. At that moment the door opened and Inspector Lestrade entered, hat in hand. He took in the scene with a grim nod. I see you've done it again, Mr. Holmes. Holmes gestured toward the widow. The evidence lies before you. You will find the remains of the butcher's cleaver in the Thames, not far from Blackfriars Bridge. As for motive, these letters will suffice. Lestrade sighed. It's always the clever ones, isn't it? Mrs. Hanbury did not resist as he led her away. The sound of her footsteps faded down the hall, leaving behind only the whisper of the fire. When the door closed, Holmes moved to the window. The fog had begun to lift, revealing a pale shaft of light over the rooftops. Watson, he said softly, observe how often tragedy grows from deceit. A lie, however small, is like a thread. Tug upon it and the whole garment unravels. I nodded gravely. Do you think she ever truly loved either of them, Hanbury or Avery? Holmes's eyes were distant. Love, my dear Watson, is the most dangerous motive of all. It blinds, corrupts, and redeems in equal measure. She loved herself first, and therein lay her downfall. He turned toward the door, collecting his coat. Come. The morning grows clearer. We have one more matter to attend before this case is laid to rest. What matter? He smiled faintly, the old spark returning to his gaze. The boy. The innocent caught in the sins of his elders. There is something about his eyes that troubles me, something that may yet demand our attention. As we stepped out into the awakening city, the church bells tolled in the distance, echoing through the thinning fog. I glanced back once at the quiet house, where shadows lingered behind curtained windows. The widow's deceit had been laid bare, her freedom lost. And yet, I could not shake the feeling that the case was not wholly over. For in Holmes's expression there flickered a thought unspoken, that the dead, though silent, sometimes leave their words behind, whispering truths we have yet to understand. Chapter 7. The Widow's Second Lie. The morning after our encounter with Clara Vane, the streets of London seemed shrouded in a deeper fog, as if the city itself wished to conceal some lingering secret. From the window of 221B Baker Street, I watched the lamps glimmer dimly through the haze. Holmes was already at his desk, scattered papers before him, the faint aroma of tobacco curling from his pipe. Watson, he said, his voice low and measured, our investigation has revealed one lie, yet I suspect another lies beneath it, one more dangerous and deliberate. I set aside my notebook. Do you mean the widow? Precisely, Holmes replied. Mrs. Hanbury's confession, though compelling, was a performance. I do not doubt her guilt in silencing her husband, but she has withheld a crucial truth. A second deception designed to divert suspicion and protect another. He rose, coat draped over his arm, and motioned for me to follow. We returned to Mortimer Lane. I have reason to believe she anticipates our visit. The street was nearly deserted, the fog muffling all sound save the distant clatter of a hansom cab. Upon arrival, the house loomed dark and imposing, its windows shadowed. Mrs. Hanbury greeted us at the door, her composure restored, veil neatly arranged. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said with measured calm. "I presume this is a social call?" Holmes inclined his head. "Not quite, madam. We are here to discuss certain letters and their consequences, and to observe rather than inquire." Her gloved hands rested lightly upon the doorframe, a slight tremor betraying her otherwise perfect poise. "I see," she said faintly. We entered the drawing room where the fire still smoldered from the previous night. Holmes gestured toward the desk. "If you would be so kind, madam, might we examine Mr. Hanbury's papers once more?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she nodded. "They are as you found them." Holmes approached the desk with deliberate care. He lifted drawers, inspected the inkstand, and turned over papers with meticulous attention. I watched him work, noting the precision with which he handled even the smallest detail. Then suddenly his eyes narrowed. "Watson," he whispered, "observe this envelope, sealed yet untouched. It bears the same handwriting as the letters from C." I leaned closer. The envelope was, indeed, peculiar. No postmark, no signs of mailing, yet it was addressed in a hand both elegant and forceful. Holmes carefully opened it and extracted its contents. Inside lay a single sheet of paper, a note written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. "George Hanbury's death was necessary. Yet Avery and Clara must not suffer for my sins. Let them believe themselves culpable while the truth remains hidden. One final precaution, the child's future secured. Eleanor H." I looked up at Holmes. "It is her own handwriting," I whispered. "Exactly," Holmes replied softly. "She confirms her previous guilt, yet frames others as participants. Avery, Clara, even the lover's intervention, all are pawns in a game of her devising. A second lie, Watson, the one that shields her ultimate motive, the preservation of her child's position and inheritance." Mrs. Hanbury's calm demeanor faltered as Holmes's words sank in. "You have no proof of this," she said, voice trembling slightly. Holmes held the note aloft. "The writing is yours, madam. Every flourish, every loop, every curve matches your known correspondence. The evidence is in your hand, literally and figuratively." She sank slowly into her chair, her face pale beneath the veil. "It was for his good," she whispered. "I had no choice. George would have destroyed everything. He would have taken my son away. I acted only to protect him." Holmes's gaze softened, yet remained unwavering. "Protection, Mrs. Hanbury, does not justify murder. But it does explain the care with which you orchestrated misdirection. You needed to divert suspicion from your child's inheritance and maintain the illusion of innocence. Avery and Clara were instruments, nothing more." I found myself trembling at the precision of her manipulation. Every step, every letter, every threat had been calculated with surgical accuracy. Yet despite the horror of her actions, one could not entirely discount the maternal instinct that drove them. Holmes turned to me, voice quiet. "Observe, Watson. A second lie can be as powerful as a first. It masks motive, obscures method, and shields those we love. In this case, her love for the child guided every act, including the murder itself." The widow lifted her gaze, eyes glimmering with unshed tears. "Do you despise me, Mr. Holmes?" she asked softly. Holmes regarded her without judgment. "I do not despise you. I am curious, I am careful, and I am aware that every human heart carries shadows. Yours are particularly long." The sound of footsteps interrupted our contemplation. Inspector Lestrade entered, hat in hand, eyes weary but alert. Holmes gestured toward the widow. "Inspector, the letter confirms the involvement of Mrs. Hanbury, though her second lie complicates matters. The child's future is the key consideration here." Lestrade nodded. "I will ensure that justice takes into account both the crime and the circumstances. It will not be as simple as it first appeared." Mrs. Hanbury lowered her veil, silent at last. Holmes gave a final glance at the papers before turning to me. "Watson, the threads of this case are nearly all revealed. The final act, the truth of motive, the resolution of inheritance, and the unmasking of every deception awaits only the child's fate." I felt a chill. "Do you truly believe the widow acted alone in spirit, if not in hand?" Holmes's eyes gleamed with certainty. "She acted alone in planning, Watson. Yet others moved unwittingly in her orbit, their misdeeds and fears entwined with hers. The widow's second lie is a testament to cunning. But it is also a warning. Deception may shield for a time, but the truth always emerges." The fog outside seemed to thin, the pale sun glinting on the damp cobblestones. A new day had dawned over Mortimer Lane, yet within the house shadows lingered. Shadows of secrets, lies, and the carefully constructed veil that the widow had drawn over her own actions. Holmes took his coat from the rack, pocketing his magnifying glass. "Come, Watson. The case is not yet concluded, but the final unraveling draws near. We must prepare for the confrontation that will reveal all: the widow's lies, the innocent's protection, and the ultimate judgment of her actions." And so, as the morning fog lifted into a pale London sky, I felt the tension of inevitability settle upon us. The widow's second lie had been uncovered, yet the final truth remained just out of reach, waiting for the final hour of revelation. Chapter 8. The Child in the Shadows. The afternoon sun struggled to pierce the persistent fog as Holmes and I made our way toward Mortimer Lane. The streets were silent, the usual clamor of London dampened by the mist that crept along the cobblestones like a living thing. There was a peculiar weight in the air, a quiet tension that made even the distant church bells seem muted. Holmes walked ahead, his coat collar turned up, eyes scanning every detail. "Watson," he said quietly, "the next piece of this puzzle is the child. Observe how closely the threads of motive, deceit, and innocence are intertwined. This is the heart of the case, where our moral compass is tested." I nodded, though unease settled in my chest. The widow's actions had been calculated, cold, yet not devoid of maternal instinct. The child, I feared, had been the ultimate pawn in her game. Upon arrival, Mrs. Hanbury met us in the front hall, her black gown impeccably arranged. Her face, pale and composed, bore the faintest trace of anxiety. She did not speak as we entered, only gestured toward the sitting room. Holmes surveyed the room carefully, eyes lingering on the small crib near the hearth. A blanket, neatly folded, covered the infant within. The child stirred faintly, a soft gurgle escaping tiny lips, entirely unaware of the tempest surrounding him. Holmes crouched beside the crib. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The child has not been exposed to harm, yet his presence is central to every deception we have uncovered. The widow's lies, the letters, even the machinations of Avery and Clara, all revolve around him." Mrs. Hanbury's hands clenched nervously in her lap. "He is innocent," she said softly, almost pleadingly. "I have protected him from everything. Nothing else matters. Holmes's gaze did not waver. Indeed. Yet protection through deceit is a dangerous gift, madam. The child's future cannot remain in the shadow of your lies. Every moment we delay brings risk of revelation and of harm. I leaned closer, studying the small face peeking from beneath the blanket. There was something almost preternaturally calm about the child, as if he sensed the weight of the secrets around him, though he was far too young to comprehend them. "Holmes," I whispered, "how do we approach this delicately? To reveal the truth might harm him, yet concealing it could invite further danger." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Balance, Watson. Justice must temper itself with mercy, especially where the innocent are concerned. We must unravel the widow's lies without breaking the child's world. Observe her carefully. Her actions reveal the contours of her plan." Mrs. Hanbury rose, approaching the crib with careful hands. She lifted the child gently, holding him close to her chest. "He must never know," she whispered. "Not yet. Not until I can secure him from the world's cruelty." Holmes did not flinch. Instead, he observed the subtle signs of tension in her posture, the tightening of her fingers, the slight tremor in her jaw, the way her eyes darted toward the window as if expecting pursuit. Each motion told a story. "Madam," he said softly, "you have acted to protect your child, yet every action you take also shapes his destiny. We are here to ensure that destiny is preserved, not destroyed by the consequences of your earlier deceptions." Her lips quivered. "I cannot lose him. If the truth comes out, I do not know what I would do." Holmes's voice remained calm. "The truth has a way of emerging, Mrs. Hanbury. The question is whether you will guide it or let it rush forth unchecked. One must always anticipate the ripple effect of one's choices." A quiet knock interrupted the tense room. The maid entered, carrying a small bundle of letters. "For Mr. Holmes, sir," she said. Holmes took the letters with a measured hand. "These arrived this morning," he said. "From Avery. It seems he seeks to clear his name, to ensure the child remains unharmed." He opened the first letter. Avery's handwriting, neat and precise, conveyed both urgency and restraint. "Dear Mr. Holmes, I fear the widow's design may yet bring peril to the boy. I write to entrust you with the truth of my actions and my innocence. I acted only to retrieve my property and at no point harmed the child or intended to do. So, please ensure he is protected." Holmes's eyes lifted, sharp and discerning. "Avery, though a pawn, has acted with conscience. He understands the stakes. This is why the widow manipulated him, to provide her with plausible deniability while preserving the child's safety." The second letter contained additional details: the timing of his visit, the precautions he took, and his observations of the household. Every line reinforced what Holmes had already deduced. The widow's hand had orchestrated every event. Holmes folded the letters carefully. "Watson, our task now is to confront the widow with this evidence. We must secure the child's future, and in doing so, reveal the final truths that have remained hidden in the shadows." Mrs. Hanbury's face paled as she sensed what was coming. I cannot allow the boy to be taken from me," she whispered, clutching him protectively. Holmes's voice was firm but measured. "Madam, we seek not to take him from you, but to ensure he is safe, and that the truth of this case is preserved. Your protection has been diligent, but deception cannot safeguard him forever. The shadows cannot remain forever around an innocent child." For a long moment the room was silent except for the soft gurgle of the infant. Then slowly, Mrs. Hanbury nodded, her grip on the child relaxing slightly. She understood that the game had ended, and that the next steps would require cooperation rather than cunning. Holmes stood pocketing the letters. Watson, observe. Innocence must be guarded with care, even when it is entangled with deceit. The child represents the final piece of this puzzle. Once we ensure his protection, the widow's second lie will no longer imperil him. I exhaled, feeling the weight of the case pressing toward resolution. The shadows that had haunted Mortimer Lane, the fog that seemed to cling to every corner of the household, were beginning to lift. Yet in Holmes's eyes I saw the anticipation of one final revelation. The closing of a mystery that had tested every measure of observation, deduction, and human understanding. As the fog outside began to dissipate into pale light, Holmes turned toward the door. "Come, Watson, the final confrontation awaits. The widow's secrets, the child's safety, and the resolution of every deception lie just ahead. We have almost reached the hour of truth." Chapter 9. The Widow's Confession. The streets of London were unusually silent that evening, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Holmes and I made our way along Mortimer Lane, the fog curling about the gas lamps and casting long, trembling shadows on the cobblestones. Each step toward the Hanbury residence felt heavy with anticipation, as if the very air expected the revelation that was to come. Holmes walked ahead, hands clasped behind his back, eyes scanning every shadow, every flicker of light. "Watson," he said quietly, "we have reached the penultimate stage of this case. The widow has concealed her motive with skill, but the truth has a habit of emerging. And tonight it will be her own hand that reveals it." I nodded, though unease settled in my chest. We had uncovered Avery's innocence, Clara Vane's unintended involvement, and the child's vulnerability. The final confrontation with Mrs. Hanbury, I knew, would test both reason and morality. The door to the Hanbury residence opened before our knock was finished, revealing the widow herself. Her black gown hung perfectly, her veil meticulously arranged, but her eyes betrayed the slightest tremor of fear. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said softly, her voice carefully modulated. "I feared your visit." Holmes inclined his head. "Fear is a reasonable sentiment, madam. We are here to settle matters that cannot remain in the shadows any longer." She moved aside, allowing us into the drawing room. The fire was low, casting flickering shadows across the walls. The child slept quietly in his crib, innocent and unknowing of the storm that surrounded him. Holmes gestured toward the widow to sit. "Mrs. Hanbury, the evidence we have gathered leaves little room for further concealment. Avery has written of his innocence. Clara Vane has fled the city in fear and remorse, and yet your own actions remain clouded by misdirection. We require your explanation, your confession in full." She drew in a shuddering breath, glancing down at the child. I suppose I must speak," she said finally, her voice breaking. "Everything I have done was for him. I could not allow George to take him, to destroy the life we might have built. He discovered the truth, that the boy was not his. He threatened to reveal it, to ruin us both. I had no choice." Holmes did not interrupt. "Please continue. The full story, madam." She sank into her chair, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "George had always been cruel. His temper was violent, and he delighted in control. When he learned the letters from Charles Avery, he believed he could use them to manipulate me. I feared for the child. I feared for myself. I arranged for Avery to return that night, knowing he would retrieve his property. I intended only to delay George, to keep him from exposing me until I could act, but when I confronted him, he threatened me. I struck in desperation. The cleaver from Mr. Briggs was close at hand. I did not plan the murder, yet it was the instrument. And then I manipulated the evidence to protect Avery and Clara, ensuring the child's safety above all else." Her confession hung in the air like a fragile wisp of smoke. Holmes listened intently, eyes narrowed, absorbing every word. "And the letters, madam?" he asked softly. "I wrote them to direct suspicion elsewhere," she admitted, "to divert attention from the truth, from me. Avery believed he was aiding me. Clara thought she was protecting her sister. It was all a lie, yet necessary. I could not let George destroy our child's future." Holmes rose, walking slowly to the window. "A web of lies for the sake of one innocent life," he murmured. "It is a curious moral calculus, madam, committing a sin to preserve virtue, and yet virtue achieved through deception remains perilously close to vice." She lowered her gaze, silent. The weight of her actions pressed upon the room like the fog outside, dense and immovable. I finally spoke, voice hesitant. "And the child, what will happen to him now?" Holmes turned, eyes bright with clarity. "The child's future will be safeguarded, Watson. The widow's second lie, though grievous, was motivated by protection. Our task is to untangle the deception without endangering the innocent. The law will judge the widow, but the child shall remain beyond harm." Mrs. Hanbury's lips trembled, and she pressed her fingers to her forehead. "I only wanted to protect him," she whispered. "I only wanted him to live free of the consequences of my past." Holmes's voice was firm yet measured. "And now, madam, justice may proceed tempered with understanding. The case is nearly concluded, but the final reconciliation of truth, consequence, and conscience lies ahead." At that moment, the door opened, and Inspector Lestrade entered, hat in hand. His eyes swept the room, noting the widow, the child, and the quiet tension between us. "I trust, Mr. Holmes, you have brought clarity to this affair." Holmes handed him the confession, along with the letters from Avery and the notes from Clara Vane. "The widow has revealed her actions, Inspector. Every deception has been laid bare. Avery and Clara are innocent. The child's welfare is secure. It is now your responsibility to administer justice accordingly." Lestrade nodded, taking in the evidence with his usual mixture of fatigue and admiration. "I will see that the law is applied fairly, Mr. Holmes, and it seems mercy may find its place too." The widow remained seated, silent, tears glistening in her eyes. Holmes stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "Your confession is complete, madam. There is no further need for concealment. The truth has emerged, and with it the weight of your actions." For a long moment the room was silent except for the gentle breathing of the sleeping child. Then Mrs. Hanbury spoke softly, almost to herself. "May he never know the cost of my deeds." Holmes's gaze lingered on the infant. "Perhaps that is the only mercy life can afford." I watched them both, feeling the gravity of the moment. The widow's confession had resolved the mystery of the murder, yet it left behind a profound moral question. Can love and protection justify actions that the law and conscience deem wrong? Holmes turned toward me, voice calm. "Watson, every case teaches us something of human nature. Here we see that even the most calculated lies may arise from a desire to protect, and that innocence often hides amid shadows of guilt. Our duty is not merely to uncover truth, but to understand it in all its complexity." As the fog outside began to lift slightly, revealing the distant outlines of London rooftops, I realized that the case of George Hanbury's death and the widow's intricate deceptions had reached its pivotal moment. The final resolution, tempered with justice and mercy, awaited the child's future. A future that through careful observation and deduction might yet remain untainted by the sins of those who sought to protect him. Chapter 10. Resolution and Revelation. The fog had lifted from London by the following morning, leaving the city washed in pale sunlight that glinted off the damp cobblestones. Even Baker Street seemed brighter, as though the streets themselves had exhaled after the long, tense days of uncertainty. Holmes and I walked in measured silence toward Mortimer Lane, the weight of anticipation settling heavily upon us. Today the case would reach its conclusion, the final truths laid bare, the lingering shadows dispersed, and the delicate balance between justice and mercy tested one last time. Holmes's expression was unusually contemplative, eyes narrowed as he surveyed the quiet streets. "Watson," he said softly, "the final act is always the most revealing. All misdirection, every hidden motive, every deception must now yield to clarity. The widow has confessed, the child is safe, and yet there remains the final challenge, understanding the intricate network of lies and ensuring that justice does not destroy innocence." I nodded, feeling the solemnity of the moment. The events of the past week, the murder, the letters, the manipulation, the fear, and the second lie, had all led to this hour. The city seemed to hold its breath with us, awaiting resolution. Arriving at the Hanbury residence, we found Mrs. Hanbury waiting in the sitting room, the child cradled carefully in her arms. Her black gown and veil were immaculate, yet her posture carried the weight of guilt and apprehension. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting gentle shadows that danced across the room, mirroring the delicate tension in the air. Holmes stepped forward first, his movements deliberate and composed. "Madam," he said quietly, "we are here to ensure that all consequences are addressed fairly, that the threads of your actions are untangled, and that the child's future remains secure. Your confessions have been thorough, yet the final assessment of responsibility requires careful consideration." Mrs. Hanbury's gaze remained fixed on the infant, lips pressed tightly together. "I understand," she whispered. "I only wish him to be safe." Holmes gestured toward the letters and notes he had collected over the past days, the messages from Avery, the fragments from Clara Vane, and the widow's own written confessions. "Observe, Watson," he said, how each element intersects. Motive, opportunity, misdirection. The puzzle pieces fall into place, revealing a pattern both tragic and instructive. I studied the documents, noting the meticulous planning behind every letter, the deliberate framing of others, and the careful orchestration designed to protect the child. The widow's cunning was undeniable, yet the morality of her actions remained complex. Holmes continued, voice measured. "The child is, of course, innocent. Every deception was aimed at preserving him, even if it meant ensnaring others in temporary suspicion. Avery's intervention, Clara's unintended presence, and even the butcher's role were consequences of careful manipulation. And yet the law cannot ignore the deliberate act that ended George Hanbury's life." The widow shivered, her veil trembling slightly. "I acted to protect him," she said softly, almost pleading. "I could not bear for him to suffer." Holmes's eyes softened, yet his tone remained firm. "Protection, however, does not absolve action. You must accept responsibility. The law will weigh your motives against the act itself. Mercy may temper judgment, but the consequences cannot vanish entirely. What remains crucial is that the child is shielded, his life unmarred by the past as much as possible." Inspector Lestrade entered at that moment, a quiet authority in his step. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, "I understand the widow has confessed fully. The evidence, along with your observations, confirms her actions. We will proceed to ensure justice is served while taking her motivations into account." The widow lowered her gaze, silently acknowledging the inevitable. "I only did what I thought necessary," she murmured. "For him." Holmes nodded thoughtfully. "Your actions, while criminal, arose from maternal instinct and fear. They were calculated, yes, but also protective. The child will remain with you under supervision, and your confession ensures that all parties know the truth. The law will guide the final measures, tempered with understanding of context and motive." Lestrade's eyes softened as he regarded the widow. We will see that her sentence considers both her guilt and the circumstances. The child's welfare will be the foremost priority. Holmes turned to me, voice low and reflective. Watson, observe the lesson here. Deception, even when motivated by love, carries consequences. The widow's second lie, though protective, ensnared others and complicated the investigation. Yet without it, the child would have been exposed to far greater danger. Human nature is rarely simple. Morality often exists in shades of gray. I nodded gravely. And the others? Avery, Clara? They are free from culpability, Holmes said. Their roles were incidental, manipulated by the widow's cunning. They acted with conscience, with the intent to preserve innocence. The truth has cleared them, and their lives may resume, scarred only by the knowledge of what occurred. The child stirred in his mother's arms, cooing softly. The sight brought a rare smile to Holmes's lips, a fleeting glimpse of satisfaction. See, Watson, he said quietly, even amid tragedy and deception, there remains innocence to protect. That is the ultimate reward of observation and deduction. To shield the helpless while revealing the truth. I felt the weight of the case lift slightly, the tension of days spent in pursuit of clarity easing. The widow's confessions had resolved the mystery of the murder, while also illuminating the moral complexities behind her actions. Holmes continued, Every case teaches us, Watson. Here we have learned that human motives are layered, that love can both justify and condemn, and that truth, though obscured, will always emerge. It is our duty to uncover it, understand it, and ensure that justice, tempered with reason and compassion, is applied. As we left Mortimer Lane that afternoon, the city seemed transformed. The fog had lifted entirely, revealing the familiar rooftops of London bathed in golden sunlight. The clatter of carriages and distant voices returned to the streets, the city alive once more. Holmes walked silently beside me, eyes scanning the bustling thoroughfares, yet his mind clearly elsewhere. Watson, he said finally, another case concluded, another lesson learned. The widow's deception, though clever and calculated, has been unraveled. The child is safe, and justice, though tempered by mercy, has prevailed. Yet the shadows of human desire and fear will continue to cast their influence in every street, in every home. We must remain vigilant. I nodded, feeling both relief and a lingering unease. The intricacies of human behavior, the layers of lies, and the fragile line between protection and criminality had been laid bare before us. Holmes glanced toward the horizon where the sun glinted on the Thames. Come, Watson. Let us return to Baker Street. There we may reflect upon the case and its lessons. The city is alive. The fog has lifted, and yet the human heart remains as complex as ever. Our duty is not only to observe, but to understand, and to protect where innocence requires it. And so we walked back through the streets of London, the memory of shadows behind us, the warmth of sunlight ahead, and the certainty that the truth, though sometimes hidden, sometimes obscured, would always find its way into the light.